Road of Religion in Life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
I'm Monsignor Edward Jordan, and today on Austin Faith Dialogue, we'll be looking at an issue that's important for this community and a concern and a runaway issue on our national scene. That's the issue of domestic violence. And our guests on the program today are Gail Rice of the Center for Battered Women and Chris Sattal of the Diocese of Austin Social Ministries. Gail, Chris, we're delighted to have you with us this morning.
It's good to be here.
This issue of domestic violence is one that's particularly painful because we're talking about violence in a situation of loving relationships with a great deal of trust. And Gail, I understand you've been working with the Center for Battered Women for some time. Could you tell us how long the center has been active in Austin?
The center started in 1977, and really as an outgrowth, I think, of the women's movement in the 60s and 70s, women coming together and talking about their experiences. In that process, one of the hidden aspects that came to the fore was this fact of violence, various kinds of abuse with intimate partners. And then a group of women coming together voluntarily in Austin began a dialogue amongst themselves and gathered the resources to open the center in the summer of 1977. It was actually the first Center for Battered Women to be organized in Texas.
So it's not connected with any particular church or church group, but the whole community, and you invite churches?
We are very interested in in creating and sustaining dialogue with churches, as we have done over the years, and right now seem to be enjoying quite a lot of interest on the part of various religious communities in looking at the church's relation to this painful and often hidden topic.
You mentioned an often hidden topic, and I think that would relate to my experience as a pastor. This is one of those issues that happen to, quote, good people. People who are genuinely achieve a lot of successful things in life and who are good in many ways.
That's right.
Could you say something about that whole dimension of violated trust, I think, is what we might call it?
Well, it's such a human problem, and so it happens to humans in all stations and situations. And I think part of what makes it so complicated is that relationships that develop that become abusive, do not start that way. They start very often with a lot of positive things happening, often a very romantic and loving beginning. And then the abuse develops gradually, incrementally, and it is in most cases mixed in with the abuse crops up, but then positive aspects, loving aspects continue to be part of the relationship, good times, positive times, and often the hope on the part of the abuser and certainly on the part of the victim that this behavior will change or stop, that it's perhaps just a side effect of drinking or of some other stressor external to or internal in the relationship. And it's hard sometimes to realize that abuse has its own life, has its own dynamic, and must be addressed. It's oftentimes explained or rationalized as, well, it only happens when someone's been drinking.
Or very tired or had a rough day at the office.
Or very tired or has lost their job and is coping with that stress. And what one finds is that oftentimes when that stress is addressed, still the dynamic of the abuse in some form continues. And as we know, abuse occurs in many forms. Everything from the use of words to lash out and hurt someone, or to strip them of some kind of self-esteem, or to put them in their place.
So it's important to realize that abuse is not always physical.
No, and rarely is it only physical.
Right.
Even when there's a physical manifestation, that's almost always accompanied by some types of verbal or psychological abuse that compound the effects of any physical abuse that may happen.
And although domestic violence involves children and sometimes elderly people, there are other resources that kind of address those problems.
Well, I'd like to say that the Center for Battered Women is very welcome and ready to speak to persons that are dealing with any form of abuse. The particular area that we address in depth is abuse between partners. But just this week I counseled on the phone with a young woman dealing with an abusive parent. And, you know, hooked her up with other, endeavored to hook her up with other resources. So anyone dealing with any aspect of abuse is welcome to call us, and we'll try to get them in touch with wherever help exists.
The center, as you described it, has been in Austin now for almost a generation, nearly 20 years. In that time, do you feel that there's been some success? There's either success in terms of a greater awareness of this as a problem, as a concern, and then more particularly, do you see women being able to come out of being victims, kind of being made whole again?
I think that one area of clear encouragement that we see and of real progress is in the interest of various social institutions in this problem, their willingness to address it. Witness the churches, spiritual communities are now taking more an interest in raising this problem within their parishes, within their congregations, examining their responsibility to address this issue and to be part of what brings it out of its secret life. So schools, churches, employers, all of these various aspects of society examining I do see a lot more of this. We also see a lot of increased consciousness and improved response on the part of the justice system. A lot more criminal and civil justice options for a victim now. There's also an effort on the part of the justice system to hold abusers accountable. Certainly this is true in Travis County, and a real effort made to try to get them into counseling, to try to help and change the problem rather than just punishing it. But I must say, though, that the challenges for any individual woman, recognizing this, knowing where to turn, feeling her way through the confusion that abuse at the hands of an intimate partner creates is always very difficult. That does not change.
Yeah, we sometimes read and hear, and this may be stereotypical, that women kind of allow themselves to be abused, or they don't seek help in time, or they don't, they're not. Why is it so difficult, in your opinion, for some women to recognize that they don't deserve this, this is an injustice, and must be stopped?
Well, I think we have a lot of historical, support for the definition of women's role being one of holding the family together in the face of adversity and putting self or threat to self secondary to the integrity of the family. And so there's that historical definition of women's role. I think also emotionally and psychologically, typically women and young men may not have received, as young people, help in thinking actively about defining what is my bottom line in a relationship. What do I expect? What do I consider to be, what does my self-respect require? And a lot of our preventive work, the prevention work that we do with young people, involves helping them to think critically, to ask these questions, to raise them and to think critically about how do I recognize when my self-respect is being violated, and what options, how do I respond to that? How do I protect myself?
What would you suggest be some criteria to distinguish between, say a love pat and a blow, between a really destructive comment and just an argument that happens in the best of relationships?
Well, I think clearly the best intentioned of us loses control of our tongue at point and may say something hurtful. And I think that what's important is for the recipient of such a comment to feel free and safe to say, what you just said really hurt my feelings, or really stung me, or I don't like how I feel when you talk this way, and I want us to talk about this. At the point at which, in a relationship, I don't feel safe to do that, then I think we're getting into risky territory. But a lot of times those early stages, if I haven't had an opportunity to learn to recognize the warning stages, then I may let those early stages go. The first insulting words, the first words that hurt me or cut me or threaten me. I may let those pass by, rationalize them, particularly if they're followed by an apology. And that means then that the core problem, what drove those words in the first place, doesn't get addressed.
so it stays hidden and it stays silent.
And it tends to grow if it's not addressed. If it's not dismantled, then my partner's...
What kind of physical contact would you think could be acceptable? Or is again it...
Well, again, what's not acceptable, and again, it's very hard for people to recognize this sometimes, is, say, in a fit of jealousy, a partner, and it can be either a man or a woman, but more frequently because of socialization, it is men who get caught in this pattern, will grab a woman and shake her, or maybe just restrain her, or push her up against a wall, or maybe just confine her to a room, not let her leave a room. This is, by my definition of behavior that is intimidating and threatening, this is abuse. It's not the most extreme form, but it is abusive. And it needs to be recognized as such and as a warning sign, and to be named and addressed as a problem. And it's very tough to do that.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important, I think, to have some safe point of reference, some person outside the relationship that one can reality test with. Because the tendency when I'm in a relationship like this, I want to believe that it's not as serious as my fears may be telling me that it is, that it's going to get better of its own, that it's going to go away. That's very human to want that. And I need someone to support the reality that maybe this is crossing a line here that's where it's becoming dangerous.
And I think reality is blurred. Before we went on the air, Chris, we were talking about some of the attitudes that are very deep in law and lore and myth, I suppose, about women. And you mentioned something I'd never heard of, about that expression, the rule of thumb.
Right. We were talking...
where did that come from?
Talking about the fact that the support for abuse has been there in very subtle ways. Well, in the Old English law tradition, there was a law that said that a man may beat his wife as long as the instrument that he used to beat her was no wider than the width of his thumb. And so that very clearly, you know, was
That's
something
where
that was...
That's where expression rule of thumb came.
Absolutely.
I had no idea.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
But, and we tend to support that sort of philosophy as much by our silence as by, you know, not being informed as to what really constitutes abuse. We're very lucky here in Austin that we do have a shelter and people that are experts, such as Gail, that are there to support us as religious congregations. And the American Bishops in 1992 wrote a document that they put out in which they very clearly state that there is never any justification for any use of abuse against women or any physical violence against women, and in which they really strongly call for congregations to begin to speak out and to break the silence. And if nothing else, to begin to talk about it from the pulpit so that women realize that they're not in this situation alone and that there are places that they can turn to get help. And in that document, they have a list of suggestions that, for instance, the people who work with youth can begin to really bring in experts to educate the kids about what does constitute a healthy relationship and a loving relationship. And, you know, first and foremost, you know, putting the dignity of the individual and, you know, being very careful that we understand some of these things from a very early age can be, you know, of a preventive nature. And there are other things that can be done.
Gail, could you talk a minute about, say, someone that you can recall who you feel has successfully coped?
Yeah.
And what happened to her?
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful things that we see happen over and over again is that once a person makes the decision to reach out and to get some support so that they break out of their isolation, out of their social isolation, then an almost magical empowerment can happen for that person, where once they feel supported, to take steps in their own behalf. Because a lot of times the person, if someone reaches out to me, I may not have the solution for them. They're going to have to find, you know, with support, they're going to have to find their path to, they're going to have to make their own decisions about what makes sense for them. And so I remember one woman who was very socially isolated and dealing with poverty, with no job, with children, I mean, just about all the obstacles that you could think of. And really with the support of a women's group at the outreach center that she came to and got hooked up with, she moved herself from that position of isolation, dependence, and really significant abuse to a freestanding, violence-free life within the space of 2.5 years. She now owns her own home, has a job, is supporting her children. And this is not to say this is easy. This takes a lot of grit, determination, and incredible courage, actually. And we see it happening all the time.
So it also takes on the part of the volunteer, the worker, the pastor, whomever, a great deal of patience.
Yes. Yes.
And I know in our culture we like to get results very, very quickly.
Right.
And tend to give up on people who don't respond immediately.
Right. And I think there's a tendency, you know, when we see or know of someone that we love or care about being abused, there's a tendency to say abuse is bad, they should get away from what is bad. But the person who is abusive is not just bad. And so, again, it's a complicated emotional scenario with a lot of bonds between people that are not just defined by abuse. The more we can really think ourselves into a victim situation and the complexity of their situation, the less we are likely to blame them or to get angry with them for not moving as fast as we would like to take self-protective action. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. Because it's almost a re-education process you're
It's
talking
absolutely
about
that.
for the victim.
It's absolutely, and they're very core questions about, you know, do I have a right to move away from someone that I love and have this history with and may have children with? And
Yeah, so you have a classic conflict of interest. I really do love my kids.
And what will it take to help him? You know,
Yeah.
what I want to help, I want to help my partner. Obviously, because they're doing this, there's some problem there. I want to help them. How do I help this person? How does leaving help?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and yet sometimes that's the only choice that's left.
We're going to take a break now, and when we return, we're going to talk more about domestic violence. Please stay with us.
Serving Austin means serving you. That has always been the primary goal of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. We are religion in action through the work of these organizations. Each plays a key role in making the capital city a better place to live, but we can't do it alone. Do you have some spare time, talents, or any resources that you can share? If you do, please call AMM at 472-7627 because serving Austin means serving you.
Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue. Our topic today is domestic violence, and our guests are Gail Rice of the Center for Battered Women and Chris Attal of the Diocese of Austin Social Ministries. We've been talking, ladies, about the need for re-education on the part of women who have been victims of domestic violence, and Chris, explaining that expression, rule of thumb, kind of explains to us how deeply this has been embedded in law and in tradition, been around a long time, attitudes that you don't easily shake. I suppose we have attitudes also about abusers, that these are evil men, gross men, crude, ignorant, those kinds of words that come to mind. As a pastor, I would say that's not true. Some of them are very sophisticated, very kind in many ways. If a person, and usually we're talking about men, finds himself in such a situation, is there any help for him? Can people really change?
They absolutely can change. Probably what's going to happen is at some point they're going to have, an individual has to have some type of personal epiphany, if you will, that there is a problem here. Because the defenses that a person who becomes abusive utilizes tend to be such that they locate blame outside themselves. It's the world's fault, it's their partner's fault. They are the victim, and so in that way they justify and rationalize their recourse to abusive or controlling behaviors. They also immediately tend to minimize so that a person who may have struck and left marked physical bruises on a partner will typically say, oh, I only pushed her, you know, she got those bruises somewhere else, or I don't know where those bruises came from. And that's in part lying to themselves as well as it is trying to delude someone else. So there's an awakening process that has to happen. One of the ways that this community, the Austin community, and many others try to awaken people is by enforcing laws against assault, even if that assault happens in the home. But tied to that, the punishment and the stop sign, if you will, that this must stop, that the Austin community has tried to establish. We also try to encourage and actually mandate people who have been arrested for abuse into counseling programs for abusers. There are 2 such programs in Austin. One is operated by Child and Family Services, and another is by the Austin Stress Clinic. They are both, and there actually is another program at the Austin Men's Center, which is more voluntary clients. They don't get any court-referred people. But all of these programs are group-formatted programs with a lot of support, a lot of education built in to help a person who finds themselves being abusive, to help them awaken to what's going on and to learn about themselves and their needs and other ways of getting their needs met in relationships other than being abusive. They're both very good programs.
And even if someone goes into a program because they're mandated, and so maybe going in somewhat unwillingly, we hear this of other kinds of problems and challenges, that can also be a moment of discovery.
It can
where
be.
it can be, finally, I am discovering something valuable about myself.
It can be. Certainly it can raise resistance, you know, mandating someone to counseling, but a percentage of those mandated will use that as an opportunity, or will maybe perhaps be caught off guard. They will hear something that relates to their experience, that opens a door for them, and they'll walk through that door. It's a difficult pattern of behavior to reverse, and unfortunately there is still a lot, in some parts of our culture, there's quite a bit of support for men at least being in control of the relationship, and so then it becomes a cloudy issue as to how far one is able to go in order to, if I'm supposed to be in control,
right,
you know, what means can I use to gain that control or to stay in control? And there's a lot of confusion about that, just as there is with the disciplining of children. If a man still defines his role as his rightful role as disciplining his wife, you know, then what means are legitimately at his disposal? And there's a lot, as you know, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of difference of opinion within different cultures.
Within different religious
within
traditions.
Different religions, just from individual to individual about what is. But bottom line, we're very clear. Any behavior that is intimidating or frightening, you know, to another person is abusive, is somewhere on that abusive continuum.
Chris, I wonder if you as a woman, and a Catholic woman in this case, have had any reflections on the role of the church and either a woman's ability to address the fact that she's being abused, or feeling that somehow her faith plays into the situation, that to reject or to talk about her husband's behavior somehow as a betrayal of her vows, anything along those lines?
Well, I've had women tell me that they have felt that they could not reach out and talk about their situation because of the church, especially the Catholic Church's teachings on divorce. But as I mentioned before, the bishops are saying that in some cases, if it's not a loving relationship and if the marriage was not, you know, a really valid one in the sense that you know, it's not a loving relationship, that certainly she has recourse. And in many cases, people might be reluctant to turn to a shelter first. So the first place they might turn would be to their pastor or to somebody in their church. And therefore, it's imperative on us as a religious community to know what the dynamics of abuse are and to know what the resources are in the community. And to be very careful, because we cannot, as lay people or even as pastors who may not have training in counseling, you put ourselves in the situation of being experts, but we certainly can be there as a faith community to listen and to begin to encourage these people to step forward and to seek help. And maybe even help them set up a plan for some sort of escape if it's really a serious situation, because the woman's safety certainly is primary importance. So it's very important for us to begin to educate our congregations and to make resources available, even in the back of the church, have pamphlets out, that sort of thing, and maybe even invite experts. In one of the parishes that I'm aware of, invited an expert from the Center for Battered Women to come speak at each of the masses. And after that, I was told the pastor had several women call him the following week, and several women called the center seeking help. And that obviously there was a problem there, and nobody had ever discussed it. Nobody had ever said, you know, this is wrong. And it was very freeing to the women to have somebody, especially the church, saying, this is not the situation you need
I
to be
preached
in.
on it a couple times last year. And it was one of those Sundays nobody came out of church saying, you were talking about me today. But I did get 2 or 3 letters and phone calls in the course of the week. So I think what you're saying is right on there.
It's just very freeing for them to hear it from...
I think very practically, if a woman or a family member or a friend feels that domestic violence is happening, who do they call? What do they do about it?
Yeah, and we would hope that people would call, you know, before they're battered, if you will.
If
You
they're
know,
afraid,
we call
I
the Center
suppose.
for Battered Women, and sometimes it's difficult to call the Center for Battered Women if you don't yet consider yourself to be battered. But our 24-hour hotline, it is 928-9070, and we really encourage people to call anonymously. They don't have to give any identifying information, and they can use the trained volunteers on that hotline, trained counselors really, as a sounding board, just to say, you know, talk to me about this. This is what's happening. Is this abusive? What steps can be taken? Are my feelings, am I going crazy? What can I do? I still love my partner. What do I have to leave? You know, what to talk through. These are very perplexing questions.
Sure, and even an abuser could call.
Yes,
You mentioned
absolutely.
several other organizations
Absolutely, and
and
also,
groups,
and I
and they
also
could
want to
find
say that males who are on the receiving end of abuse, we stand ready to talk with them, and we have sheltered several men in the last 12 months.
Oh,
I have counseled face-to-face several men, and I have talked to men on the telephone. So we are very ready to offer our services to male victims of abuse as well as to women.
Good. And Chris, I know the Diocese of Austin has had a couple of programs in the last 18 months or so, and I think there's one coming up.
We're planning a retreat for women who have been survivors of domestic abuse, or someone who's facing abuse, or someone who perhaps has somebody in their family or works with people who are suffering from abuse. And it will be held, it's an overnight retreat, a Friday and Saturday, April the 26th and 27th. And it'll be held at Cedar Break, which is our renewal center for the
Right
diocese.
near Belton.
Outside of Belton. Right, and there's a phone number people can call if they want more information. It's area code 817-780-2436, and they can call that number for more information.
Very good.
But it's certainly an opportunity to experience some of the healing that can take place.
Well, this is an issue that is a definite concern nationwide and in our own communities and our own parishes and congregations. And I'd like to thank Chris Attal and Gail Rice for being with us today and for talking about these issues and sharing your experience. And on behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, I am Monsignor Edward Jordan, thanking you for joining us and inviting you back next week for Austin Faith Dialogue.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.